10 federal buildings under siege. EOLA burning through the night, its skyline drowned in smoke and fear. And at the heart of it all, one man, J.D. Vance, staring down a choice no leader should ever have to face: stand firm and risk tearing a nation apart, or step back and watch the city fall. The weight of a country rests on his shoulders as streets once filled with dreams now echo with sirens and shattered glass. What follows is a story woven from the threads of history and imagination, inspired by real tensions, real struggles, and real courage, a fictional account that reflects the emotions and divisions many Americans have felt. Though this is a crafted story, its purpose is to honor the spirit of those who face impossible choices to protect what matters most. Now ask yourself, if everything you believed in came under fire, what stand would you take? Join us and let this story remind you why the hardest stands are always the ones that matter most. Los Angeles was no longer the city of stars tonight. It was a city of ashes, a city gasping beneath a sky that glowed red with fire. From the harbor to the Hollywood Hills, flames licked the skyline like angry fingers, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across empty streets. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid bite of burning plastic. Every breath felt like swallowing embers. Sirens wailed from every direction, a sorrowful chorus rising and falling like the city's last desperate heartbeat. Shattered glass crunched underfoot as first responders scrambled through alleyways littered with debris. Federal buildings, once symbols of strength, now stood battered, their windows blown out, facades blackened, and flags torn and dangling like forgotten promises. And into this inferno, J.D. Vance arrived. His military transport touched down on a secure airfield, far from the chaos but close enough that the glow of destruction painted the tarmac in blood-orange hues. The hum of engines died, and before the dust even settled, camera crews swarmed the plane's ramp. Lenses aimed like weapons, desperate to capture the face of the man sent to hold the line. J.D. stepped out. His boots hit the ground with a heavy finality. No wave to the cameras, no forced smile. His face was stone, the face of a man who knew that no speech, no gesture, could make this right tonight. The flames reflected in his eyes, but there was no flicker of panic, only the weight of what he had come to do. As he climbed into the waiting SUV, the door slammed shut, sealing him in with the low murmur of radios crackling updates. Code words, coordinates, voices tight with urgency. The convoy sped into the city, and J.D. watched through tinted glass as the Los Angeles he remembered slipped away. Families barricaded their doors with whatever they could find. Furniture, plywood, even mattresses. Eyes wide with fear, faces lit only by the fires outside. A mother clutched her child to her chest, rocking gently as if the act alone could shield them from the world unraveling beyond their walls. At intersections, Marines stood guard at federal buildings, their silhouettes stark against the flames, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning rooftops and alleys. J.D.'s gaze caught on one flag, tattered, its stripes barely holding together, clinging to the pole in the hot wind like it, too, refused to fall. But what gripped him most was the silence between the sirens, that eerie stillness where the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever came next. J.D. leaned forward, studying the chaos, his mind racing. Who had let it come to this? How many more nights like this could the nation survive? And then came the radio's voice, clipped, urgent. Confirmed, 7th federal building breached, fire spreading, crowd numbers growing, units requesting immediate reinforcement. J.D.'s heart pounded, but his voice when he spoke was steady. Tell them, we hold. No matter what. The SUV took a sharp corner, tires screeching on broken pavement. Outside, graffiti scrawled across walls screamed warnings. No federal rule. Burn it all. J.D. clenched his jaw. The city was teetering on a knife's edge, and the night was far from over. And somewhere deep in that burning city, J.D. knew decisions were being made. Decisions that would test the soul of the nation. But one thought kept echoing in his mind, louder than the sirens, sharper than the glass beneath the tires. Who had failed the city? And could he stop it from falling further? The SUV's tires hissed as it came to a stop, the distant glow of the fires still flickering across the windshield like the heartbeat of a city in agony. Without a word, JD stepped out, his boots hitting the concrete with a heavy thud that seemed to echo the weight settling on his shoulders. The command center loomed ahead, a squat, fortified building that once managed drills and paperwork, now transformed into the nerve center of a city under siege. As the doors opened, the noise outside dimmed, replaced by a tense hum of radios, boots on tile, and hushed voices delivering updates no one wanted to hear. JD moved through the corridors with purpose, nodding at Marines, ICE agents, and FBI officers who looked up with weary eyes. Men and women who had seen too much in too few hours. The briefing room was stark, maps plastered across every wall, tables littered with reports, coffee cups long gone cold. Screens blinked with grainy drone footage, streets choked with mobs, flames dancing on courthouse steps, figures scattering in the darkness. The air was thick not just with smoke that had found its way inside, but with tension so sharp it seemed to hum beneath the fluorescent lights. JD stood at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the hardened faces of leaders who had fought battles in foreign lands but now fought on their own soil. The head of the FBI's local division spoke first, his voice low and clipped, every word heavy with frustration. "We've lost perimeter control at 2 federal courthouses. They breached through the south entrances. Molotov cocktails, makeshift battering rams. Our agents are holding the upper floors, but they're outnumbered." Before JD could respond, an ICE field officer added, his tone tight with restrained anger. "We've had agents' home addresses leaked, families threatened, some forced to move tonight. Sir, we're dealing with more than just a riot. This is coordinated." A murmur rippled around the room, the unspoken truth settling in. This wasn't chaos born of anger alone. This was something more calculated, more dangerous. JD clenched the edge of the table, feeling the cold steel beneath his fingers, trying to anchor himself against the storm outside and the storm within. His eyes fell on a satellite image of the city, burning points of light marking every breach, every fire, every place where law and order had crumbled. A jewel of America. That's what Los Angeles had always been in his mind. A beacon of dreams, innovation, promise. Now it felt like that jewel had been dropped, shattered, its pieces ground underfoot by forces that no longer cared for what it represented. He exhaled slowly, the words forming, before he even realized he'd spoken them, his voice quiet but resolute. "This city, a jewel of America. We let it burn on our watch." Around the table, heads lowered slightly, not in shame, but in the recognition of the weight they all bore. The weight of every decision made, every decision still to come. And as the briefing continued, reports pouring in, more ambushes, more federal sites under threat, more families calling for help. JD felt that weight settle deeper, but beneath it, something else stirred. Resolve. Because the city might have been burning, but it hadn't fallen. Not yet. And as long as they stood, as long as they chose to fight for it, there was still a chance to turn the tide. The thought bridged him forward, carried him from the grim tally of the present into the decisions of the next moment. Decisions that would define not just this night, but what kind of nation would rise with the dawn. The room seemed to shrink as the reports mounted, the weight of each word pressing in on JD from every side. The maps, the faces, the hum of radios, they blurred for a breath, then sharpened as he straightened, drawing from that quiet place where duty drowns out doubt. The conversation shifted from updates to decisions, and all eyes turned to him. The room fell still, waiting for the man who, like it or not, now held the city's fate in his hands. A legal advisor spoke first, voice measured but urgent. "Sir, any large-scale deployment will draw fire from city officials and media. They'll claim federal overreach." His fingers tapped a folder, thick with precedent, warnings, and hesitation. Across the table, a military officer leaned in, his brow furrowed. "We're losing ground by the hour. With your order, we can lock down key sites within 2. But every minute we wait, we risk losing another building, or worse." JD listened, weighing their words as if they were stones in his palm. The legal risks were real. The political storm would be fierce. But out there, beyond these walls, beyond these maps, were men and women standing their posts, families huddled behind barricades, a city teetering on the edge of ruin. Another advisor, this one political, cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Vice President, the optics, if this escalates, if there are casualties, this could define your career, maybe the next election. The president's too. His voice trailed off, realizing too late how small that sounded in the face of what was at stake. JD's gaze drifted back to the riot maps, the red dots marking fires and breaches like open wounds. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in resolve. Careers could be rebuilt, elections won or lost. But a city once fallen to chaos was far harder to restore. The silence stretched, the room holding its breath, until at last JD spoke, his voice calm but steeled. We're not going to debate while they burn down what's left of this city. He turned to the military officer, his eyes clear. You have my order. Reinforce all federal properties. Protect the civilians wherever you can. His tone left no room for question, no space for retreat. The officer gave a sharp nod, already signaling his team, the room springing to life as commands relayed, strategies adjusted. But JD remained where he was, rooted, staring at the map as the others moved around him. He saw not just buildings and streets, but the lives behind them, the mother he'd seen clutching her child, the Marine standing guard beneath a torn flag, the agents whose families now lived in fear. And though the roar of urgency filled the room, for JD, the world narrowed to a single, quiet promise he made to himself. To them, to the city that still fought to survive. His fingers brushed the map's edge, tracing the line where federal ground met a city in flames. His breath was slow, deliberate, and when he spoke, it was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a nation's hope. Tonight, we hold the line. The night had surrendered at last to the first fragile light of dawn. Smoke still curled above the city, hanging low like a shroud, but beyond it, the sky glowed faintly gold, as if trying to remind Los Angeles that even after its darkest hours, the sun would rise. J.D. Vance stood behind the podium, hastily set up before the federal building, its scorched facade still smoldering in places. The cracked marble steps beneath his boots a silent testament to the battle of the night before. The press had gathered in force, cameras jostling for position, microphones thrust forward like spears. Their lenses glinted in the pale light, hungry for every word, every expression, every hint of weakness or strength. Beyond them, a crowd had formed. Civilians, first responders, officers off duty, and onlookers drawn by equal parts curiosity and desperation for answers. Some faces showed hope, others anger, many exhaustion. JD let his gaze sweep the scene, taking it all in. The city scarred but standing, the people divided but listening. He inhaled the sharp morning air, tasting ash and resolve. And then, without notes, without a teleprompter, he spoke. His voice, hoarse from the long night, carried clear and steady over the hushed crowd. We don't save nations with noise, but with courage. The words hung there for a beat, carried on the breeze that stirred the tattered flag above him. And today this city, this country, needs courage more than ever. The murmurs began as soon as he continued. JD's gaze hardened, his tone edged with conviction. We are here because law and order, the foundation of any free society, was attacked, and let's speak plainly about why. This didn't happen by accident. This wasn't inevitable. It happened because leaders like Governor Gavin Newsom and Mayor Karen Bass, turned their backs on the men and women who protect this city. They chose politics over public safety, and they emboldened those who would burn, destroy, and divide. The crowd reacted as if a match had been struck. Applause burst from some quarters, sharp, defiant, filled with relief that someone had finally spoken aloud what they felt. But with it came boos, jeers, voices rising in protest. Liar, someone shouted. Shame, came another. The tension thickened, pressing in on all sides like the smoke that still clung to the streets. JD didn't flinch. His eyes moved deliberately across the crowd, meeting both supporters and critics with the same steady gaze. We did not come here to point fingers for the sake of blame. We came to draw a line. This city will not fall. Its people will not be abandoned. And as long as we have breath, we will stand between them and those who would tear it apart. His words found their mark. The applause grew louder in places, defiant and insistent, even as dissenting voices tried to rise above it. The press cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance of the moment. A city at a crossroads, its wounds fresh, its future uncertain. JD stepped back for just a breath, letting the crowd's conflicting voices wash over him. He felt the weight of every eye fixed on him, felt the gravity of the moment pressing deeper. But beneath it all, he felt the flicker of resolve reignite, the understanding that courage was not in the noise or the clash, but in the choice to stand firm when it mattered most. And as he left the podium, the sky above Los Angeles brightened just a little more, as if dawn itself were waiting to see what would come next. As the last echoes of applause and protest faded behind him, J.D. Vance stepped off the podium, the weight of the moment settling heavier with each stride. The air smelled of ash and hot concrete, and the morning light, though brighter now, seemed unable to pierce the lingering gloom. Without pausing for rest, he moved toward the waiting convoy. There was no time for speeches now, only action. The city's heart was still bleeding, and he needed to see it for himself. The streets unfolded before him like scenes from a nightmare. Federal buildings, proud and unshaken for generations, bore fresh scars from the night's assault. Windows blown out, walls charred black, flags torn and trampled. J.D. stepped from the vehicle at the first sight, what was once a federal courthouse, and felt the crunch of glass beneath his boots. The air was heavy with smoke and something worse, betrayal. Graffiti scrawled in red and black marred the stone. "Traitors! No rulers here! Burn it down!" J.D.'s jaw tightened as he walked the perimeter, each message cutting deeper than the last. He could feel the fury rise, mingling with sorrow, as his eyes traced the ruined symbols of law and unity. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a declaration, a rejection of everything that held a nation together. And yet, beneath the anger, resolve began to crystallize. He stopped beside a cluster of officers, battered, hollow-eyed, their uniforms streaked with soot and sweat. A young Marine, no older than his early 20s, stood at attention, though his hands trembled. J.D. met his gaze, and for a moment, the clamor of the broken city seemed to fall away. The Marine's voice, low and raw, broke the silence. "Sir, they came for my family. Last night. Protesters. They found where we live. My wife, my little girl. We got them out, but..." His voice faltered, the weight of what almost was stealing the air from his lungs. J.D. placed a firm hand on the Marine's shoulder. The young man tried to steady himself, but his eyes glistened with the truth of what he'd seen. What he feared would come again. And J.D. felt it all, the fury at the cowards who would cross such lines, the sorrow for the innocents lost in those hours, and beneath it all, a hardening purpose. This could not be allowed to stand. The tour continued, each site a fresh wound. At one building, the steps were blackened where fires had been set. At another, bullet holes pocked the entrance. J.D. listened as commanders reported numbers, breaches, injuries, damage tallies. But it was the faces that stayed with him, faces of those who had stood when others fled, who now wondered if their city, their country, still stood with them. As J.D. climbed back into the SUV, the city's shattered heart beat all around him. But within his own chest, another beat had begun, steadier, stronger. The city was wounded, but not defeated, and neither was he. The decisions ahead would be harder still. But this morning had shown him what was at stake, not in theory, but in flesh and blood, in stone and flame. The time for hesitation had passed. The SUV's door closed behind J.D. with a weighty thud, sealing him back into the hum of radio chatter and tense silence. The images of the battered city burned fresh in his mind. The scorched courthouses, the graffiti, the trembling Marine's words still echoing in his ears. But as the convoy pulled away from the latest site, It wasn't just the physical damage JD was steeling himself against. The storm was growing, and this time, it wasn't just outside on the streets. By the time JD reached the command center, reports from staffers confirmed what he had sensed all along. Local officials, those who should have been partners in restoring order, were turning their backs. The governor's office had issued a statement condemning the federal response, calling it an occupation. The mayor had gone on local radio, urging calm but painting JD and his team as instigators, outsiders who had only inflamed tensions. The news channels were relentless, their anchors and pundits dissecting every move, every order JD had given, their words framing him as an invader rather than a defender. JD stood in the operations room, the screens before him flickering with live feeds, not just of the city streets, but of news broadcasts, scrolling headlines, talking heads debating his every decision. Federal overreach, escalation of violence, a city under siege. The weight of perception settled heavily alongside the weight of responsibility. He knew how these narratives could shape the future as much as any riot or fire. Yet outside, the reality told its own story. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the smoke-hazed sky, protesters began to gather again. Small at first, scattered groups with signs and chants. But as darkness crept over the city, their numbers swelled, as if the cover of night emboldened them. The feeds showed them converging on federal sites once more. Buildings barely recovered from the night before, now bracing for renewed assault. JD watched the scenes unfold in real time. Barricades reinforced, agents taking positions, Marines steady at their posts. The hum of preparation filled the room, a tension that gripped every corner, but never broke into panic. His commanders turned to him for orders, for guidance. But for a moment, JD simply stood there, eyes fixed on the screens, mind sharp and quiet. He thought of the young Marine again, of the families who had fled their homes, of the officers who had stood their ground while the world debated the optics. And in that stillness, in that space between decision and action, a vow formed, not shouted, not shared with the room, but made in the deepest part of himself where doubt could not reach. They'll break before we do. His lips barely moved as he spoke the words, but their weight was absolute. He turned, issuing clear, calm orders. Reinforce all sites, de-escalate where possible, but hold firm. His team moved quickly, voices low but certain. The machinery of defense set in motion once more. Outside, the night belonged to the city, but JD had drawn his line. And tonight, no matter what came, that line would hold. Night fell fast, as if the city itself was eager to be swallowed by the dark. From the command center's reinforced windows, JD Vance watched the last light fade, the horizon swallowed by smoke and shadow. And with the dark came the storm. Radios crackled with tension as the first wave began, chants turning into roars, scattered protesters surging forward, emboldened by numbers and by night. The feeds on the monitors flickered and filled with chaos. Outside the federal courthouse, rocks arced through the air, striking windows that had barely been repaired. Bottles exploded in bursts of flame against stone. A metal barricade fell with a metallic shriek as a group surged forward, only to be pushed back by federal officers holding their ground. JD could almost feel the heat through the screen as a Molotov cocktail shattered against a wall, flames crawling like serpents up its side. In the streets, clouds of tear gas billowed, rolling low and thick, swallowing the figures that darted and stumbled through it. Flashbangs cracked like thunder, splitting the night with bursts of white light that froze scenes in stark, haunting images. A Marine pulling a fellow officer to safety, a rioter mid-throw, a flag still clinging to its pole despite the onslaught. JD stood at the center of the operations room, his hands resting on the edge of the table, knuckles white, eyes moving from screen to screen. Every report that came in was sharper, more dire. Perimeter breach on the west side. Fire set at the immigration offices. Units requesting immediate backup. They're trying to take the vehicle depot. The voices over the comms were trained, controlled, but the strain bled through. He issued orders with calm precision, his voice steady against the rising tide of panic outside. Redirect 2 units to the west. Priority on protecting the courthouse and archives. I want eyes on that depot. No vehicles leave that compound. His team moved with practiced speed, carrying out his commands, but JD knew this wasn't just a clash of bodies and barricades. This was the moment the city's will would be tested. He glanced again at the screens, and beyond the chaos, he saw glimpses of humanity. An officer shielding a civilian who'd been caught between lines, a medic tending to a fallen agent as debris rained down, even a protester pulling another out of the path of advancing crowds. The night wasn't black and white. It never was. But it was dangerous, and it was his to face. JD inhaled slowly, feeling the burn of exhaustion in his chest, the weight of responsibility pressing down like the smoke pressing on the city's streets. Reports kept coming. Injuries, fires, close calls. And through it all, the map on the main screen glowed with the markers of conflict, spreading, shifting, testing every point of defense. But the line JD had drawn, held. Outside of the flashbangs echoed again, and the night flared bright for just a moment before darkness reclaimed it. Inside, JD kept his gaze fixed on the fight, knowing that tonight would decide far more than control of buildings or streets. It would decide whether hope still had a place in the city of angels. The first crack came over the radio. Not the static of interference, but the voice of an officer, breathless, strained. Command, courthouse perimeter breached. Repeat, we've lost the front entrance. They're inside. The words hit like a hammer. In the operations room, the tension that had simmered all night surged to the surface, as if the walls themselves felt the weight of failure. J.D. Vance didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the live feed. Figures flooding through shattered doors, smoke trailing in behind them like a dark tide. Without hesitation, J.D. leaned over the comms console, his voice calm but ironclad. Deploy the Marines, contain the breach. We take that building back. Orders rippled through the channels, and on the screens, J.D. watched as armored units moved like shadows through the smoke, flanking the courthouse, closing in. Flashbangs burst again, the night briefly turning to day as federal forces pressed forward, wresting control from the chaos. The protesters who had surged in were driven back step by step, the roar of the clash echoing through the city's hollow streets. But just as the courthouse's front was secured, a new threat rose, one J.D. hadn't anticipated in this form. A group had gathered on the courthouse steps, holding their ground even as the crowds dispersed. They weren't masked agitators or opportunists. J.D. could see them clearly on the screens. Older faces, men and women in faded military jackets, caps bearing insignias from wars past. Veterans. The room buzzed with conflicting advice. Move them out, disperse them, make no distinction. But J.D. felt the knot in his chest tighten. He shook his head once, decisive. No, I'll talk to them. His team looked at him, startled, but they knew better than to argue. Within minutes, J.D. was on the move, stepping out into the night thick with smoke and tension, flanked by security who kept a wary distance as he crossed the scarred plaza. The veterans watched him approach, their faces a mix of defiance and exhaustion, their signs lowered but not discarded. One, an older man with silver hair and weary eyes, stepped forward as spokesman. "You think we wanted this?" he said, voice rough with emotion. "We served this country. We bled for it. We're here because it's slipping away." J.D. met his gaze, and for a heartbeat, the riot, the orders, the headlines all faded. He saw the pain behind the man's words, the fear, the frustration. But he also saw the danger. The line between patriot and agitator blurred by rage and despair. His own inner conflict sharpened. Are these men and women lost to the cause, or fighting to remind the nation of what it's supposed to be? "I know you love this country," J.D. said quietly, his voice carrying in the hush that had fallen over the plaza. "But this," he gestured to the broken doors, the scorched stone, "this won't save it. I need you to stand down. Let us do our job so we can rebuild, not bury what we fought for." The silver-haired veteran studied him, the weight of decades in his gaze. Around him the others shifted, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. And then, slowly, he nodded. "We'll go, but don't make us regret trusting you." As they stepped back into the night's shadows, J.D. stood for a moment longer, staring at the courthouse, at the wreckage and the promise it still held. The battle wasn't over. Not out here, not inside him. But for tonight, one line had been held without a shot fired. The night had given all it had: fury, fire, and the deafening clash of wills. Now, as the first light of dawn crept over the scarred skyline, the city lay in uneasy silence, as if even it had no words left for what had transpired. The last radio reports echoed through the command center. Courthouse secure. Federal sites holding. Crowds dispersing. The storm had passed, but J.D. Vance knew better than to call it peace. Stepping out into the pale morning, J.D. felt the weight of the night pressed down on him in a way no map or monitor could ever convey. The streets were eerily empty, save for the lingering smoke that clung to every corner and the scattered debris that told the story of what had been defended and what had been lost. He walked without an escort now, needing no buffer between himself and the truth of the ground he had sworn to protect. Glass crunched under his boots, the shards glittering like bitter confetti in the dawn. Here, a storefront gutted by fire. There, the blackened shell of a police cruiser, its tires melted to the asphalt. And everywhere, the marks of the night's violence: scorched pavement, walls pockmarked by impact, banners and flags torn to ribbons. J.D.'s gaze moved over it all, not as a politician cataloging damage, but as a man taking the full measure of a city's pain. And yet, amid the ruin, signs of defiance remained. A courthouse flag, battered and soot-stained, still clung to its pole, stubbornly lifting in the breeze. A mural of the Constitution on a federal building wall, streaked with smoke but unburned, the words "We the People" still visible through the grime. Small things, perhaps, but to J.D., they were reminders of what had been held together when so much threatened to fall apart. The cost had been steep. Reports tallied injuries among law enforcement and protesters alike, some serious. Federal buildings would need weeks, months to repair. Businesses already battered by hard times faced new ruin. And then there were the wounds not so easily counted: the fraying trust, the deeper divisions that no flashbang could disperse. J.D. felt it in the quiet of the morning, in the way the city seemed to hesitate between breaths, unsure what would come next. He stopped at the courthouse steps, the very ground where hours earlier a standoff had threatened to ignite all over again. He could still hear the words of the veteran, "Don't make us regret trusting you." That trust, fragile as the dawn itself, felt like the most precious thing left standing. J.D. exhaled slowly, the taste of smoke and resolve mingling on his tongue. Victory, if this was victory, had come at a price, and J.D. knew that tonight's battle was only one in a longer war. A war for the soul of the city, the nation, and perhaps his own. But as he turned back toward the command center, the sky above him warmed with light, and for the first time in many hours, the day felt possible again. The sun had barely claimed the sky before the second storm began. This one not of fire and stone, but of words, images, and opinions hurled faster than any Molotov the night before. J.D. Vance had barely returned to the command center when the media machine roared to life. Screens filled with footage of the night's chaos, officers clashing with rioters, flames licking courthouse steps. J.D. on the plaza steps facing down the veterans at dawn. The scenes played in endless loops, dissected by pundits and anchors, their voices rising in judgment, analysis, praise, and condemnation. On some networks, J.D. was hailed as the man who had saved Los Angeles from collapse, the steady hand in a storm that could have consumed the city. Clips of his speech at dawn were played with triumphant music beneath them, his words about courage and duty framed as the rallying cry of a nation seeking order. Commentators praised his calm under pressure, his willingness to stand on the front lines, to negotiate instead of escalate. But on other channels, the narrative was starkly different. J.D.'s actions were labeled overreach, his presence in Los Angeles described as an occupation, a provocation that had turned tense protests into violent eruptions. Headlines questioned his judgment. Did Vance's troops bring war to our streets? Federal force or federal folly? Experts lined up to second-guess his orders, to point to injuries, damage, division as the true legacy of his night's work. J.D. stood in the operations room, watching the split-screen reality unfold. the voices blending into noise that seemed as thick as the smoke that still clung to the city's air. His team filtered in and out, relaying updates. Streets clearing, cleanup underway, officials arranging meetings. But JD's gaze remained on the screens for a long moment, absorbing not just the coverage, but the truth it reflected. The nation was as divided this morning as it had been the night before. Poll data scrolled along the bottom of one broadcast. Flash polls taken in the early hours, measuring the pulse of a country that had watched the night's events in real time. The numbers told the same story as the screens. The public was split down the middle. Half saw him as a hero who had stood firm when the city needed it most. Half saw him as a villain who had deepened the wounds of a fragile place. JD exhaled slowly, his reflection faint in the glass of a darkened monitor. The words rose in his mind, unbidden but true. Justice has no poll numbers. He whispered it, as if to remind himself that duty wasn't measured in approval ratings or headlines. Duty was what kept the line steady when everything else threatened to fall apart. Outside the command center's walls, the city stirred to life, its streets littered with debris but filled with the first tentative steps toward recovery. Inside, JD turned from the screens at last. The storm of opinion would rage on, louder than any siren, more persistent than any riot. But for now there was work to do, a city to rebuild, and a nation to steady. And JD knew where his focus had to remain, not on the noise, but on the task at hand. The storm of headlines and heated debates continued to swirl, but even as pundits filled the airwaves with noise, another current began to flow. Quieter, but far more meaningful to JD Vance. It started with a single letter, placed carefully on his desk in the command center. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the paper smudged at the corners as if held tightly during a sleepless night. Mr. Vance, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I had to write. My son works at a small shop near the federal courthouse. Last night, I watched the news in terror, sure I'd lose him. But your people held the line. His shop stands. You have my gratitude and my prayers. JD read it twice, the words cutting through the noise of the media storm like a clear bell. It wasn't praise for politics or policy. It was a mother's relief, raw and real, and it meant more to him than any poll or headline. And that letter was only the first. Over the next hours, more messages arrived, some handwritten, some typed, some sent through aides who handed them over with knowing glances. There were notes from shopkeepers who had feared losing everything, from teachers thankful their schools had been spared the flames, from ordinary citizens who simply wanted to say they had seen the effort, the sacrifice. One envelope held a child's crayon drawing, a Marine standing tall in front of a school, flag waving above, beneath it in bold letters, "Thank you for keeping us safe." JD kept that drawing beside him, propped against his monitor. Each time the news cycle shifted, each time another commentator questioned his choices, he glanced at it and remembered why he'd stood his ground. But words were not enough. By midday, JD was back on the streets, walking with his security detail through areas still scarred by the night's chaos. The city was trying to heal. The acrid smell of smoke lingered, but now it mixed with the sharper tang of fresh-cut lumber and the metallic clatter of scaffolding going up. Outside one federal building, where shattered windows gaped like broken teeth, crews worked to board up the damage. JD approached, boots crunching over debris, and the workers looked up, surprised but respectful. He didn't offer speeches here. Instead, he moved from person to person, shaking hands, asking names, offering simple thanks. "You're holding this place together," he said to one man hauling heavy sheets of plywood. "And I won't forget it." A woman in a hard hat paused long enough to nod at him, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. "We saw you last night, sir. You didn't let them take it. We'll do our part now." Her words weren't for cameras. There were no cameras. They were for him, for the moment. And they carried more weight than any soundbite. As JD continued down the block, pausing to speak with more workers, he felt the city's pulse beneath the scars. Tentative but beating, fragile but determined. The voices of the people weren't shouting on television or filling columns online. They were here in the quiet rebuilding, in the gratitude written by shaking hands, in the crayon lines of a child who felt safe enough to draw. And as JD turned back toward the command center, the noise of the media felt a little farther away. Here on the ground was the truth he needed to hear. The goodwill of the people, the letters, the handshakes, the quiet thanks on smoke-stained streets, carried J.D. Vance through the day. But as night approached once more, another storm gathered. This one spun from words broadcast far and wide. Local politicians, emboldened by the spotlight, intensified their attacks. Press conferences, interviews, social media posts. They painted J.D. as the villain of the hour. A congresswoman stood before a sea of microphones, her voice sharp with righteous fury. What we saw last night wasn't justice. It was federal occupation. J.D. Vance didn't protect this city. He escalated its suffering. A city councilman echoed the charge on local radio. Our neighborhoods aren't battlegrounds. Vance turned them into one. He's not here for us. He's here for power. Every hour seemed to bring a new headline, a new accusation. Vance, hero or hazard? Who really lit the flames in L.A.? The narrative took shape, dangerous not because of its volume, but because of its simplicity. J.D. wasn't a man who stood the line. He was the outsider who crossed it. J.D. watched the clips from his office in the command center, each word landing heavier than the last. He knew the truth was more complex, it always was, but complexity rarely sold airtime or clicks. What did was outrage, and tonight, outrage was in no short supply. Rather than retreat behind closed doors, J.D. chose the harder path. By evening, he stood before a packed town hall, the smell of smoke still faint on the breeze that drifted through open windows. There were no spotlights, no grand stage, just a small platform, a microphone that occasionally crackled, and a crowd that came to listen, to challenge, to judge. J.D. looked out at them, business owners with arms folded tight, parents clutching their children's hands, activists holding signs that read, "No more violence," and "Our city, our voice." The tension in the room was palpable, as brittle as dry wood. But when he spoke, his voice carried warmth, not fire. "I didn't come here for politics," he began, his tone steady, unguarded. "I came because people were in danger. I came because federal property, your property, was under attack. And I came because I believed, and still believe, that no city, no matter how scarred, should be left to burn." He let his words settle, let the room breathe. "I know many of you are angry. I know you're afraid. I saw it in your eyes last night. But I also saw bravery. I saw neighbors protecting neighbors. I saw first responders standing their ground. And I saw a city that, even through its darkest hours, didn't give up." Questions followed, some respectful, some barbed. J.D. answered each without deflection, without disdain. He spoke of duty, of choices made in moments no one should have to face. He acknowledged the pain, the cost, but he never wavered in his belief that standing firm had been the right call. By the time the town hall ended, the mood had shifted, not to unanimous approval, but to something more valuable, understanding. The dangerous narrative would persist, J.D. knew. But tonight, he had met it not with noise, but with clarity. And in that, there was strength. The town hall had ended, but J.D. Vance's work was far from over. As dawn painted the horizon in muted gold and the city tried to steady itself after another sleepless night, a fresh battle took shape. Not on the streets, but in the courts. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals became the new front line, as lawsuits began flying from every direction, challenging the legality of the federal intervention J.D. had overseen. News outlets were quick to seize on the drama. Headlines scrolled across screens. Federal overreach? L.A. leaders sue over troop deployment. Courts to decide protection or occupation. Commentators debated the filings with fervor, their voices layered with both legal jargon and political venom. The very actions that had, in J.D.'s mind, kept a city from burning to its foundations were now framed by some as violations of civil liberty and abuse of federal power. J.D. stood in the command center's conference room, the night smoke still faint in the air, as if refusing to fully release its hold. Before him, his legal team spread out files, court documents, constitutional references, and memos. The room was quieter than during the nights of riots, but no less tense. The stakes were just as high, only now the fight was for history's judgment as much as the nation's laws. One of the senior legal counsels, a woman who had served through more than one administration, spoke first. The lawsuits are broad in scope, Vice President. They'll argue you acted without sufficient local consent, that the deployment of federal forces escalated the violence. She tapped a thick binder. We've seen these arguments before, but the context here is complicated. The timeline of events will be key. JD listened, absorbing the nuances, the legal fine print that could determine whether his decisions were upheld or condemned. His gaze shifted to the windows, where the city stretched beyond, wounded but standing. He thought of the Marines who had held the line, of the agents who'd been ambushed protecting public buildings, of the families who had written, thanking him for saving their small piece of the city. And he thought of the veterans on the courthouse steps, their faith placed, however reluctantly, in his hands. He turned back to the table, his voice low but certain. We don't just defend what we did with law, we defend it with truth. We didn't escalate, we contained. We didn't occupy, we protected. And I need every argument we present to reflect that. This isn't about politics, it's about what was right. The team nodded, already marking notes, shaping strategy, preparing for hearings that would be watched by a nation still raw from the chaos. JD leaned over the table, his finger tracing the timeline laid out on a chart. Each decision, each order, now under scrutiny, dissected in courtrooms far removed from the smoke and fire of those nights. But he welcomed the scrutiny, because he knew what he had seen, what he had fought for. Outside, the city stirred, its wounds visible, its spirit bruised but unbroken. Inside, JD prepared to fight once more. Not with flashbangs or barricades this time, but with words, evidence, and resolve. And as he gathered himself for the battles ahead, one truth guided him. Standing for justice would never be easy, and it would never be decided by headlines alone. The legal battle was only just beginning, but even as J.D. Vance and his team prepared for the courtroom, a darker, more personal threat began to rise. It came not in the form of lawsuits or televised debates, but through whispered warnings, late-night calls, and reports that chilled the blood more than any headline could. Across the city and beyond, far-left agitators, emboldened by the chaos and fueled by resentment, had begun to target those who had stood the line. Officers, agents, Marines, not on duty, but at home. Names and addresses leaked, families harassed, windows shattered in the dead of night. Some had fled to safe houses, others lived in fear behind locked doors and drawn curtains, waiting for the next knock that might not be friendly. J.D. read the reports in silence at first, the words stark against the white of the page. ICE agents' residence vandalized. Border Patrol officer's spouse followed leaving work. Children of federal personnel threatened on social media. The fury he'd kept tightly controlled through nights of fire and riot simmered beneath his calm exterior. The city's battlefields had shifted, but the war had not ended. Now it was a war waged against families, the innocent, the unseen, the ones who bore the cost without ever lifting a shield. He refused to let that stand. J.D. arranged quiet visits to several of the families now in hiding. No cameras, no press, only him and a minimal security detail. The first safe house was small, tucked in a quiet corner of the city where sirens seemed a distant memory. Inside, the air was heavy with worry. A mother kept her children close, their wide eyes tracking every movement. A father, still in the uniform he had worn through the riots, stood rigid with helplessness he could not hide. J.D. spoke to them not as a leader issuing orders, but as a man who understood what was being asked of them. To endure, to hope, to trust. His voice was steady but carried the weight of his promise. You didn't sign up for this, and neither did your children. But your strength, your courage, it lights the way for all of us. And I will not let that light be snuffed out by cowards who hide behind threats and shadows. The words mattered, but so did the presence, the listening. J.D. stayed longer than his team advised, hearing their fears, their small triumphs, how neighbors had stood watch, how strangers had offered quiet acts of kindness. And at each stop, he left not just with more names to protect, but with a renewed sense of purpose. By the time he returned to the command center, night had begun to fall again, casting the city in long, uneasy shadows. But this battle, JD knew, would not be fought with barricades or tear gas. It would be fought with vigilance, with the strength of those who refused to be broken, and with a promise that no family standing for what was right would stand alone. The weight of the day pressed down on J.D. Vance as he stepped back into the command center. The air inside still carried the faint, lingering smell of smoke from nights past, mingling now with the sterile scent of paper and coffee gone cold. His mind raced with everything he had seen, the families in hiding, their quiet resilience, their unspoken questions that lingered in every glance. When will this end? When will it be safe to go home? Before he could sit, an aide approached, voice low but urgent. "Sir, the president is on the line for you." J.D. nodded, his pulse quickening, though his face betrayed nothing. He crossed the room, picked up the secure phone, and pressed it to his ear. Donald Trump's voice came through, unmistakable in its bluntness and force. "JD, I've been watching. I've been briefed. You did what needed doing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." For a moment, JD said nothing, letting the words settle, letting the tension that had built over endless hours ease just slightly. The president's tone was firm, but not hurried, and beneath it JD could hear what wasn't said. The awareness of how close the city had come to falling. The knowledge of the political firestorm still raging beyond the smoke. "Thank you, Mr. President," JD replied, his voice steady, though fatigue tugged at its edges. "We held the line, but there's a long road ahead. The city's scarred, trust is frayed, and people are scared. This can't be where it ends." Trump didn't hesitate. "I know, and you'll stay in the fight, I have no doubt. These people, the good people, they'll see who stood for them. The rest, let them talk. Let them sue. We'll handle it. You focus on keeping order and getting that city back on its feet. We've got your back." The conversation was brief, but as JD hung up the phone, the room seemed quieter, the air heavier with what came next. The validation from the nation's highest office brought a measure of relief, a confirmation that the hard calls, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt had not gone unseen. But it also underscored the burden that still rested on his shoulders. It wasn't enough that the fires had been put out, that federal buildings still stood, or that families had found refuge for another night. Now came the harder task, rebuilding trust, stitching together a community frayed by violence and fear, finding a path back to something resembling peace. JD stepped to the window, looking out at the city as dusk began to fall again, the lights of Los Angeles flickering to life one by one. It was a city trying to remember how to breathe, how to hope, how to believe that the worst had passed. He saw the boarded windows, the blackened walls, the quiet figures sweeping debris from sidewalks. Ordinary people doing the work of recovery long after the cameras had moved on. He felt the weight of their hopes, their expectations, and he knew this was the true fight now. Not the clash of flashbangs and barricades, but the quieter, longer struggle to restore faith in law, in leadership, in one another. His thoughts were interrupted as another report came in. Small flare-ups, isolated protests, nothing like the nights before. But JD knew how quickly sparks could catch. He straightened, resolve sharpening again. The president's call had offered support, but the work was his to finish, and he would, because he owed it to every family he'd met, every officer who had stood their post, and every citizen who still believed the city was worth saving. The brief calm that followed the president's call felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. J.D. Vance knew it wouldn't last. By the next morning, fresh intelligence began to trickle into the command center, and what started as rumors solidified into a grim reality. Flyers, encrypted messages, social media posts spreading beneath the radar, all pointed to the same chilling plan. Another riot was being organized, larger, angrier, determined to finish what the last had failed to do. The targets were clear. Federal buildings that had withstood the previous onslaught now faced renewed threat. The courthouse still bearing scars from fire and stone, the immigration offices that had become a lightning rod for rage, even a federal archive that housed decades of the city's history, all marked, all vulnerable. JD stood before the operations team as the reports were laid out, his face carved from stone, his mind already working through the possibilities. His advisors exchanged wary glances, their voices hushed as they debated the details. The risk was enormous. The city was on edge, its people weary. Another night of violence might not just scar the landscape. It might break the spirit of the city for good. And yet, JD's first instinct wasn't to order more barricades or to flood the streets with additional forces. He leaned over the table, his eyes sweeping the maps, the lists of sites at risk. When he spoke, his voice carried both steel and sincerity. We prepare, yes, we protect. But before that, we try, one more time, to stop this before it starts. Reach out to community leaders, faith groups, veterans organizations. I want everyone who has a voice that matters to stand with us in calling for peace. We've held the line once. Now let's try to pull the city back from the edge. The team moved quickly, their orders clear. But even as calls went out, as appeals for calm spread across airwaves and networks of influence, JD knew he couldn't rely on words alone. The forces under his command were briefed, their positions reassessed, reinforcements readied. Tear gas, shields, barricades, all prepared, not because he wanted them used, but because he couldn't afford to hope for the best and plan for less. Outside the command center, the city felt caught in a breathless pause. JD stepped to the window, looking out over the rooftops and streets that stretched toward the horizon, the afternoon sun casting long shadows that seemed to foreshadow the night to come. In the distance, sirens echoed, not yet for this new storm, but reminders of how quickly order could unravel. He thought of the families he'd met, the workers repairing what had been damaged, the Marine who had spoken of threats to his loved ones. All of them, waiting, watching, trusting that those in charge would keep them safe. The weight of that trust settled on him once more, as heavy as any armor, as sharp as any blade. JD turned back to his team, his voice calm but resolute. Make sure our people are ready, but remind them, we stand for peace first. We defend only if we must. Tonight, we show this city and the nation that strength isn't in how loudly we answer violence, but in how hard we work to prevent it. As the sun dipped lower, JD knew the city was balancing on a knife's edge. The hours ahead would test not just his plans, but the very soul of Los Angeles, and he intended to meet that test head-on. As dusk fell over Los Angeles, the tension thickened, heavy as the smoke that still clung to corners of the battered city. From the command post, JD Vance watched the crowd gather beyond the barricades. Hundreds, perhaps more, signs raised, voices swelling as night took hold. The city stood at the edge of another abyss, and JD knew this was the hour that would define whether it fell or stepped back from the brink. The plans were in place. Reinforcements stood ready. Orders had been issued to hold the line without provoking, to defend but not escalate. But as JD looked out at the sea of faces, the chants rising and falling like a tide, he knew something more was needed. Not strategy, not force, something human. Without a word to his team, JD stepped away from the table, moving through the operations center and out into the night air. The officers at the entrance stiffened as he passed, their concern clear, but they didn't stop him. He walked beyond the fortified doors, beyond the shields and helmets, unarmed, exposed, standing beneath the glow of floodlights that bathed the federal building's steps in stark white. The crowd's noise wavered as they noticed him. Shouts mingled with murmurs. Cameras swung toward him, capturing the unexpected moment. JD raised his hands, palms open, not in surrender, but in peace. His voice carried clear across the plaza, steady despite the storm of voices before him. "I'm not here to order you home," he began, his tone firm but without anger. "I'm not here to silence your voices. I'm here because this right here, this is what makes our country strong. The right to stand, to speak, to be heard. But hear me too." The protesters quieted in patches, curiosity battling outrage. Some lowered their signs, their eyes fixed on him. Others shouted louder, slogans lost beneath the sound of their own fury. JD held his ground, his gaze sweeping the crowd not as an opponent, but as a man seeking connection. "I was a kid in a town where people felt forgotten. I know what it means to feel ignored, to feel powerless. But burning what we've built together doesn't give us power. It takes it away. It hands victory to chaos. He let the words settle. Let them find their mark where they could. A woman near the front lowered her sign, her face conflicted. A man beside her hesitated, his chant faltering. But further back, others jeered, their anger too long fed to be starved by words alone. JD pressed on. Honor isn't found in breaking windows or setting fires. It's in standing up for what's right without tearing down what's ours. I'm asking you, all of you, choose tonight to show the world that strength doesn't come from destruction. It comes from courage, from restraint, from choosing a harder path because it's the right one. A ripple moved through the crowd, part unease, part reflection. Some protesters shifted their footing, the energy of the mob faltering, breaking into fragments of uncertainty. Others, still defiant, shouted for him to leave, their words harsh but edged with something else. Fear, frustration, exhaustion. JD stood his ground, unflinching. He had no illusions that all would turn back, that peace would win the night with a single speech. But he had come because it mattered to try, to remind them and himself of what was worth defending. Behind him, the lights of the command post burned steady, ready if needed. Before him, a city held its breath. The night, which had threatened to spiral once more into chaos, passed with a stillness that felt almost surreal. As the hours crept toward dawn, the chants that had filled the plaza softened, scattered, and eventually faded altogether. The protesters dispersed, some in quiet reflection, others in frustration, but all without the violence that had marred so many nights before. The barricades remained, the floodlights continued to hum, but they had not been tested. JD Vance remained at the command post long after the crowd had thinned, standing at the window that overlooked the plaza, where only hours earlier he had faced the storm with nothing but his voice and his conviction. His reflection stared back at him, marked by the fatigue that no armor could block, no speech could mask. The adrenaline had long ebbed, leaving in its place the bone-deep exhaustion that only nights like this could bring. Yet beneath that weariness, there was something else, a quiet pride, not loud or boastful, but steady, born of knowing that for this night at least, escalation had been avoided not through force, but through courage and reason. The city had been given a chance to breathe. One by one, officers and agents entered the room, their faces lined with relief. A captain of the Federal Protective Service approached, his uniform still dusty from the night's long watch. "Sir," he said simply, extending his hand, "thank you. I don't think it would have gone this way without what you did out there." JD shook the man's hand, feeling the shared weight of what they had all carried. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was everyone who chose to hold steady, who chose to believe there was a better way." Others echoed similar sentiments, nods of respect, quiet words of thanks, the kind of gratitude that came not from orders followed, but from a mission shared. They had stood the line together, and together they had held. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, JD stepped outside once more. The city felt different in this pale light, still scarred, still weary, but intact. The federal buildings stood as they had before, their walls marked but unbreached. The air was cool, carrying the smell of dew and ash mingled, the scent of survival. JD walked the perimeter, passing the men and women who had kept watch through the night. Some leaned against barricades, exhaustion etched into their posture. But when they saw him, they straightened, offering quiet nods that spoke volumes. No fanfare, no victory parades, just the silent bond of those who had done their duty and done it well. He paused at the steps of the courthouse, the same ground where he had faced the protesters, where words had been his only shield. He let the moment settle over him, feeling the weight of what had been risked, what had been spared. The fatigue tugged at him now, heavier than before, but beneath it was a deep certainty. They had chosen the harder path, and for this night it had been enough. The work ahead would be long. The wounds, visible and hidden, would take time to heal. But JD knew they had taken a step toward that healing, and it had mattered. As the sun climbed higher, casting gold over the city's battered streets, JD turned back toward the command post. The storm had passed. The day was waiting. The city breathed again. As dawn's first soft light spilled over the rooftops of Los Angeles, J.D. Vance walked its streets. Not the streets of fear and fury he had faced nights before, but streets reborn with the quiet hum of resilience. He moved without entourage, without armor, just a man walking through the fragile aftermath of a storm, witnessing the beginnings of repair. Debris still littered corners where fire and stone had clashed, but now there was movement, the purposeful rhythm of a city determined not to let scars define it. At one federal building, J.D. paused, watching a worker atop scaffolding carefully affix a new flag to a freshly mended pole. The cloth unfurled slowly, catching the breeze, its colors stark against the pale morning sky. For a moment, J.D. let the sight fill him, a reminder that what had been torn could be made whole again. Further along, he passed a schoolyard where children streamed through gates, backpacks bouncing, voices rising in cheerful chatter. Teachers greeted them with tired smiles, their relief palpable in the simple act of opening doors. J.D. lingered, unnoticed, heart stirred by the sound of laughter where sirens had once wailed. He thought of the nights they had endured, the choices made in darkness, the weight of every command. And now, in this fragile light, the truth settled over him like the morning mist. They had held the line, and now came the harder work, building beyond it. The city had been spared collapse, but it was only the beginning. The real legacy would be in what came next. Miles away, in a classroom filled with sunlight and the soft rustle of turning pages, a civics teacher stood before a group of students, their faces bright with curiosity and questions shaped by the world they had watched tremble. On the screen at the front of the room, J.D.'s speech from that dawn 2 nights ago played. His call for courage, for reason, for the strength found in restraint. The teacher clicked the video to pause, turning to face the room. "This," she said, voice steady, "is what leadership can look like. Not always perfect, not without controversy, but willing to stand for something when it matters." A boy, no more than 12, raised his hand, his voice tentative but filled with the spark of a dream. "Could I do that one day?" The room grew quiet, the weight of the question settling over them all. The teacher smiled, the kind of smile that came from hope hard-won. "Yes," she said simply. "You could, because leadership doesn't start on a podium. It starts in moments like this, when you choose to care, when you choose to act." The boy nodded, eyes bright, as if seeing a path open before him that had not been there before. Around him, his classmates sat a little straighter, the seed of possibility planted where doubt had once lived. Back in the city's heart, J.D. walked still, the rhythm of recovery beneath his feet. As the sun climbed higher, casting gold across the buildings that bore the marks of battle, he let the noise of the world fall away. He needed no headlines now, no judgments from pundits or polls. What mattered was here, in the voices of workers rebuilding, in the laughter of children returning, in the quiet courage of those who had stood the line with him. In his pocket, J.D. carried a small shard of steel, salvaged from the damaged courthouse, its edges worn smooth by his touch. It was a reminder of what had been risked, what had been saved, and what remained to be done. He paused at a rise overlooking the city, the horizon stretching out before him, the future uncertain but waiting. The morning breeze lifted the edge of his coat, cool and clean, as if washing away the smoke that had so long clung to the air. J.D. closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in that promise, feeling the weight of the steel in his hand, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. When he opened them, the city glowed beneath the rising sun, and his final thought formed, not shouted, not proclaimed, but carried quietly within him, stronger than any riot's roar, deeper than any speech could reach. Nations aren't saved by noise. They're saved by those who care enough to fight, to stand, to rebuild when the fires die down. With that, J.D. faced the dawn, ready for whatever came next, not as a man seeking glory, but as one who understood that the true legacy of the stand was not in the night they had survived, but in the day they had been given the chance to build. And as he stepped forward, the city stepped with him toward a future still theirs to shape. This story is a powerful reminder that true leadership is not found in noise or grandstanding, but in the quiet courage to do what is right when the world seems to be falling apart. J.D. Vance's stand was not about seeking praise or avoiding blame. It was about protecting what matters and giving a wounded city a chance to heal. His choices reflect a universal truth. Real strength lies in restraint, compassion, and the willingness to rebuild after the storm. It inspires us to consider our own role in times of division and challenge. What would you do if it were your community, your future on the line? How would you choose to lead when it counts most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.